There's a strange silence that happens after a role disappears. Maybe you stopped being the busy professional. Maybe the relationship ended. Maybe the kids left home. Maybe the project that defined you for years suddenly finished. And now, something feels missing. Not just the routine, not just the responsibility, but you. You wake up and realize something unsettling. You don't know who you are without that role. And the strange part is, no one really talks about what the brain does in that moment. Because losing a role doesn't just change your schedule, it quietly destabilizes something much deeper, your identity system. And once that system is disrupted, the mind starts doing something unexpected. Something that explains the confusion, the restlessness, and the strange emotional fog. But to understand it, we need to look at how identity actually works inside the brain. Most people think identity is something philosophical, something abstract. But psychologically, identity is actually a prediction system. Your brain constantly asks one question: what kind of person am I in this situation? And roles answer that question automatically. If you're a manager, the brain knows how to behave in meetings. If you're a parent, the brain knows how to structure your day. If you're the reliable one in a relationship, the brain knows your emotional position. Roles are like mental shortcuts. They reduce cognitive load. They make decisions easier. But when a defining role disappears, the brain loses one of its prediction anchors. And suddenly, simple things start feeling strangely difficult. You hesitate before making decisions. You question habits that once felt natural. You wonder things like, should I still wake up this early? Do I even enjoy this? Was that part of me real or just the role? And slowly, the mind starts drifting into something psychologists sometimes call an identity vacuum. Not depression, not necessarily anxiety, but a quiet absence of structure. Because your brain was used to organizing life around a central role. Without it, the internal map goes blank. And when the brain loses a map, it does something predictable. It starts searching for a replacement. But that search can create confusion, self-doubt, and emotional instability. And here's the part that's easy to misunderstand. This reaction doesn't mean you're weak. It means your brain was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Psychologically, roles are not just social labels. They are adaptive structures. They help the brain compress complexity. Imagine trying to decide how to behave in every situation from scratch. Every conversation, every responsibility, every social interaction. It would exhaust your cognitive resources. So the brain builds identity modules, small packages of expectations and behaviors. Parent, leader, caregiver, student, partner. Each role tells the brain, this is how we act here. The more time you spend in one role, the more neural pathways strengthen around it. Neuroscientists call this habitual identity reinforcement. Your brain literally wires itself around the pattern. So when the role disappears, the brain doesn't just lose a job or a relationship. It loses a large cluster of neural predictions, which creates that strange internal question, who am I now? But that question isn't a crisis. It's actually the brain preparing for something important: reconstruction. To understand this better, imagine the brain as a navigation system. Roles act like GPS coordinates. They tell the mind where it is and where it's going. For example, if your role is dedicated professional, the brain predicts wake up early, check emails, solve problems, achieve goals. That pattern becomes efficient, automatic. But when the role disappears, it's like the GPS suddenly says, signal lost. The brain hates uncertainty, so it starts scanning memories, emotions, and possibilities, trying to re-anchor identity. Neuroscience suggests this process heavily involves the default mode network, the brain system responsible for self-reflection and autobiographical thinking. When identity is stable, the network runs quietly. But when identity is disrupted, it becomes highly active. You start replaying memories, questioning past choices, imagining alternative futures. This is why losing a role often leads to intense self-reflection. Not because something is wrong, but because the brain is trying to update the internal model of who you are. Think of identity like a bookshelf. For years, one role occupied the center. When that book disappears, the shelf looks strangely empty, and the brain begins asking, what belongs here now? But filling that space requires something most people never learned: a different way of building identity. Instead of rushing to replace the lost role, psychology suggests something counterintuitive. You slow down the reconstruction process. Because identity built in panic usually becomes another fragile role. Here are two principles that help the brain rebuild identity more sustainably. 1. Separate the role from the traits. When a role disappears, the brain often assumes the traits disappeared too. But roles are containers. Traits are capabilities. For example, you may no longer be a manager, but the traits might still be there: decision-making, organization, mentoring. What to do? Write down the role you lost, then list the underlying traits it used. Why it works in the brain? This helps the prefrontal cortex recategorize identity away from rigid labels and toward flexible abilities. Example: someone who loses a sports career may realize the deeper trait was discipline, which can appear in many areas of life. Identity becomes transferable, not fragile. 2. Introduce low-stakes exploration. When identity is unstable, the brain becomes risk-averse. It fears choosing the wrong direction. So instead of big decisions, use small experiments. What to do? Try activities with no identity pressure. New classes, volunteer work, creative hobbies. Why it works? This activates the brain's dopamine-driven curiosity system, which encourages exploration without triggering fear of failure. Example: someone leaving a corporate career might casually explore teaching, consulting, or writing, not as a commitment, just as data collection.